So we continue our study of Lukács's ideology of modernism. We were looking at page 1224. On 1224, Lukács says the obsession with morbidity had ceased to have a merely decorative function, bringing color into the greyness of reality and become a moral protest against capitalism. So Lukács points out that one of the chief features of modernism had become obsession with morbidity. So he discussed how psychopathology became very important with modernism, and this obsession with morbidity or the psychopathology of being, that came to be a kind of protest against capitalism. So the modernist writers, they were protesting against capitalism by emphasizing on morbidity and psychopathology. And Lukács gives us the examples of a number of authors, Franz Kafka, Musil, and so on. So here he begins with Musil, Robert Musil. With Musil and with many other modernist writers, psychopathology became the goal, the terminus ad quem. Terminus ad quem means the end point, the final goal. The terminus ad quem of their artistic intention. But there is a double difficulty inherent in their intention which follows from its underlying ideology. First, there is a lack of definition. The protest expressed by this flight into psychopathology is an abstract gesture. Its rejection of reality is wholesale and summary, containing no concrete criticism. So, modernist art becomes more of an abstract gesture because it delves into psychopathology, which is abstract, and it avoids concrete depictions or concrete descriptions. The protest expressed by this flight into psychopathology is an abstract gesture. Its rejection of reality is wholesale and summary. So, Lukács's main argument in this essay is that modernism is a refutation of realism. The modernist writer rejects realism, and he has discussed how even though in Kafka or in Joyce we have many realistic passages, but in Kafka the realism or the details, they create a kind of nightmarish fear, and in Joyce the details of realism, they are not real at all because they are all in the consciousness of some character. So for Lukács, realism means classical realism or traditional realism, the realism of 19th century French novel. That realism is rejected by modernism. The bourgeois protest against feudal society, the proletarian against bourgeois society, made their point of departure a criticism of the old order. So earlier protests had always began from criticizing the reality at hand. So the bourgeois rebellion, the bourgeois rebels, they protested against feudal society, the features of feudal society. The proletarians protest against bourgeois society from a Marxist point of view. They also realistically depict the bourgeois society. But the modernists' rebellion or protest against bourgeois society does not begin from any concrete depiction of the society which it is protesting against. So, in the earlier cases of bourgeois rebellion or proletarian rebellion, they reached out beyond the point of departure. The protest reaching out beyond the point of departure was based on a concrete terminus ad quem, that is, a goal to which one intends to arrive. Terminus ad quem, the establishment of a new order. So both proletarian revolution against bourgeois society projected a new order, and bourgeois rebellion against feudalism projected a new order. But what about the modernist rebel against bourgeois society? That does not project any goal or terminus ad quem. How different the protest of writers like Musil? The terminus ad quem, the corrupt society of our time, is inevitably the main source of energy. So, terminus ad quem, that is the point of departure. That is the corrupt society. Since the terminus ad quem, the escape into psychopathology, is a mere abstraction. So the modernist writers, they escape from the corrupt bourgeois society to the world of psychopathology, which is not only morbid but also abstract. The rejection of modern reality is purely subjective. Considered in terms of man's relation with his environment, it lacks both content and direction. So Lukács's basic protest against, or we may say criticism against, the modernist kind of writing is that the relationship between man and his environment is diluted or neglected in this kind of writing. For the protest is an empty gesture expressing nausea or discomfort, longing, as I gave you the example of Sartre's novel Nausea, an existential nausea. These writers are not wholly wrong in believing that psychopathology is their surest refuge. It is the ideological complement of their historical position. So, by making a dialectical analysis, Lukács says that these modernist writers are not wrong, that their only refuge is psychopathology. Their refuge is psychopathology because of their historical position. And because of their historical position, they do not have a concrete goal before them or any new order that they can imagine. This obsession with the pathological is not only to be found in literature. Freud's psychoanalysis is its most obvious expression. So, for Lukács, the modernist effects of psychopathology and Freudian discussion of psychoanalysis, they are concomitant. They go together. They are expressions of the same moment in history. As everybody knows, Freud's starting point was everyday life. In order to explain sleeps and daydreams, however, he had to have recourse to psychopathology. So, Freud discussed everyday life and daydreams, linguistic sleeps, and in order to explain that, he had to take recourse to psychopathology. Therefore, Freud's departure was also the complete reality of his time. In his lecture, speaking of resistance and repression, he says, our interest in the general psychology of symptom formation increases as we understand to what extent the study of pathological conditions can shed light on the workings of the normal mind. So, pathological conditions are important for Freud in order to understand normality. He believed he had found the key to the understanding of the normal personality in the psychology of the abnormal. This belief is still more evident in the typology of Kretschmer, which also assumes that psychological abnormalities can explain normal psychology. So here Lucas is referring to another writer, Kretschmer, who created a psychopathology of abnormality. Here, Ernst Kretschmer, 1888 to 1964, was a German psychiatrist who researched the human constitution and established a typology. So he spoke about 4 kinds of physique, that is physical structure, bodily structure, and according to the 4 kinds of bodily structure, he imagined that there were 4 kinds of temperament or 4 types of mind. This classification was based on 4 main body types: asthenic, thin, small, weak; athletic, muscular, large bone; hook-neck, stocky, fat; dysplastic, unproportionate body. The concept of 2 great psychopathological types of manic depressive or circular insanity and dementia precox was developed by Emil Petri. So these German scientists, Kretschmer, Kraepelin, they were kind of helpful for Freud also, as they were trying to classify the human body and the human different kinds of insanity, and these classifications would help them in understanding the modern type of man, or mentality, temperament, normality, abnormality, and so on. So we go back to our text. So Lukács was talking about Kretschmer's typology, 4 types of the body, 4 structures of the body. It is only when we compare Freud's psychology with that of Pavlov, who takes the Hippocratic view that mental abnormality is a deviation from a norm, that we see it in its true light. So Pavlov, another scientist who studied reflexes, as you know the story of Pavlov's dog, and another teacher of psychoanalysis, he also suggested that mental abnormality is a deviation from a norm. Now you can of course understand that this was the kind of theorizing which distinguished strictly between norm and abnormality, normality and abnormality. That helped to institutionalize the centers of mental treatment or asylums, against which Michel Foucault later theorized in his Discipline of Punish, the rise of the institutions that punished individuals or attempted to discipline them in an arbitrary fashion. This is of course a legacy of the Enlightenment, which believed that everything could be defined, classified, and every knowledge can be used as an instrument. There is this theory of the use of logic as an instrumental logic, in the hands of capitalism, by Adorno and Horkheimer. In their book, The Dialectic of Enlightenment, Theodor Adorno and Horkheimer, they theorized that the legacy of Kantian logic led to this later use of rationality as an instrument, which they define as kind of a fall from the high standard or the high ideal of the Enlightenment. The ideal of rationality as something noble and supreme. When that rationality or reason becomes an instrument of oppression, then it is no longer noble. However, Lukács is not speaking of that. So Lukács is just giving us a sketch of the development of theories of psychopathology and how these theories are concomitant with the depiction of morbidity and psychopathology in literature. Clearly, this is not strictly a scientific or literary critical problem. It is an ideological problem deriving from the ontological dogma of the solitariness of man. So Lukács is trying to find the philosophical root of this theory or this approach of modernism, and says that it is not scientific or literary problem, but it is an ideological problem. So all ideology would have some philosophical basis. So Lukács says that the dogma of solitariness of man, the philosophy that man is alone in this universe. Of course, he is suggesting or he is hinting at Heidegger's philosophy, Geworfenheit, the thrownness of man. So this ideological or ontological dogma that man is solitary. The literature of realism based on the Aristotelian concept of man as zoon politikon is entitled to develop a new typology for each new phase in the evolution of society. It displays for each new phase in the evolution of society. So the realism, the realist tradition, Lukács says, was based on the Aristotelian concept of man as a social animal or political animal, zoon politikon, out of which kind of typology would develop for evolution of man at different phases of society. It displays the contradictions within society and within the individual in the context of dialectical unity. So here Lukács is explaining realism of the 19th century or realism that began from the Renaissance, because he mentions Shakespeare and then goes on to speak of Balzac and Stendhal as if they belong to the same tradition, the same realistic tradition. So according to Lukács, this realism or this realistic tradition developed out of the basis of Aristotle's idea that man is a political animal, and therefore each phase of man's society, human society, would evolve according to a particular typology. Here individuals embodying violent and extraordinary passions are still within the range of a socially normal typology. Notice that Lukács suggests that even in this great realistic tradition, we find description of insanity, madness, violence. In spite of all that, it belongs to a socially normal typology. Okay. So immediately what comes to our mind is the different kinds of characters in Shakespeare who represent madness, insanity. In Balzac also there is description of such characters. So Lukács' point is that even though authors like Shakespeare, Balzac and Stendhal, they describe people with extreme passion, violent passion or some kind of insanity, even then they all belong to a normal typology. For in this literature, the average man is simply a dimmer reflection of the contradictions always existing in man and society. So it is clear that Lukács favors the realistic tradition, realism of the great bourgeois writers against the ideology of the modernist. So man is a reflection of contradictions that exist in man and society. Eccentricity is a socially conditioned distortion. Obviously, the passions of the great heroes must not be confused with eccentricity in the colloquial sense. Christian Buddenbrook, again a character in Thomas Mann, as you know that Lukács considered Thomas Mann to be in the same realistic tradition, even though he is a modernist writer. Christian Badenbroek is an eccentric. Adrian Leverkuhn is not. So, Adrian Leverkuhn is a character in Dr. Faustus. Christian Badenbroek is a character in Badenbrooks by Thomas Mann. So, the depiction of an eccentric character does not mean that it is the same as the heroes of high emotion or great passion. So a writer like Thomas Mann, whom Lukács believes belongs in the tradition of realism, even though he is a modernist writer, can create characters who belong to this line of great heroes like Adrian Leverkuhn, or a character like Christian Badenbroek, who is an exception. And now he explains which philosophy is behind the attraction towards psychopathology and the abstractions of modernism. The ontology of Gevorgenheit makes a true typology impossible. It is replaced by an abstract polarity of the eccentric and the socially average. Typology. Now this word Lukács uses, it is a word also used in religion. However, here Lukács uses it most probably to refer to types of characters that we often find in drama or in literature. So typology suggests that the characters are realistic. Some features are exaggerated or found in excess in some of the characters, so that character becomes a type. So typology we find in Ben Jonson's play, his theory of humor, comedy of humor. Type characters we find in Molière, we find in writers of the realistic tradition. This typology is absent in modernist writing, because typology is still realism. But in modernist writing, this typology is replaced by or substituted by eccentricism and an average character. Okay. So you notice the difference. A type character may have some feature which is exaggerated or which is in excess, but still it is realistic. But an average character, realism or realistic literature hardly ever represents an average character. An average character is a character which is very vague, which is difficult to describe because it does not have any particular feature. And then the eccentric character. Eccentric here means one who is not realistic at all, in no sense. So these are the two poles in modernist literature, eccentric and average, as opposed to the type character of realism. We have seen why this polarity, which in traditional realism serves to increase our understanding of social normality, leads in modernism to a fascination with morbid eccentricity. So in traditional realism, a type character who has some exaggeration, some eccentric features, make us more interested in understanding what is normal in society. But in modernist literature, such an eccentric character leads to morbidity. Eccentricity becomes a necessary complement of the average, and this polarity is held to exhaust human potential. So if eccentricity and average exhausts human potentiality, then we must say that modernist writers are looking at potentiality in a very limited way. You remember Lucas's distinction between abstract potentiality and concrete potentiality. So the potentialities which modernist writers are looking at, none of them can become concrete potentiality, because these are all abstractions, theorizations. In reality, one would never find an average man like this. In reality, one would never find a man like Meursault, Albert Camus' hero in The Stranger, or a man like Molloy in Samuel Beckett. So, average man is actually an abstraction. In reality, nobody is average. There is no such man who is an average. So Musil is another author who indulges in this kind of eccentricity. The implications of this ideology are shown in another remark of Musil's. If humanity dreamed collectively to dream Moosbrugger. So Moosbrugger is a character in his novel, A Man Without Quality. So you may imagine, or can you imagine, a man without quality? Actually, it is very far-fetched, very difficult to imagine. But Musil writes that the collective dream of humanity would be like Moosbrugger. That is, a mentally retarded sexual pervert with homicidal tendencies. So for Musil, this kind of a criminal, psychopathological character who is a mentally retarded and sexually pervert with homicidal tendencies, this kind of a character is the collective dream of humanity. Therefore, obviously, for Marxists, it is very difficult to digest that this is what humanity dreams of. What served with Musil as the ideological basis of a new typology, escape into neurosis as a protest against the evils of society, becomes with other modernist writers an immutable conditio humae. So, in Musil, Lucas says that it was a kind of escape into neurosis, and there was an element of protest against society, it is the evils of society. But for other modernist writers, it becomes human fate, conditio humae, after André Malraux's novel, after the name of Malraux's novel, Human Condition. It actually means human fate. Musil's statement loses its conditional and becomes a simple description of reality. Lack of objectivity in the description of the outer world finds its complement in the reduction of reality to a nightmare. Beckett's Molloy is perhaps the ne plus ultra of this development. It is the ultimate point of this development. Although Joyce's vision of reality as an incoherent stream of consciousness had already assumed in Faulkner a nightmare quality. So, whether it is Musil or Beckett or Joyce or Faulkner, Lukács says that there is something nightmarish about the modernist notion of the human condition. In Beckett's novel, we have the same vision twice over. It presents us with an image of the utmost human degradation, an idiot's vegetative existence. So this novel, Molloy, there we find the chief protagonist or hero is an idiot. Then, as help is imminent from mysterious, unspecified source, the rescuer himself sinks into idiocy. So, idiocy seems to be the human fate here. There is no escape. The story is told through the parallel streams of consciousness of the idiot and of his rescuer, along with the adoption of perversity and idiocy as types of the conditio humae. We find what amounts to frank glorification. Then, glorification of human fate, or this extremely psychopathological nature of the human situation. And then Lucas refers to Montherlant, the French author. I am referring you to the notes once again. You see, the name is very long. Marie Joseph Frederic Expedit Mignon de Montherlant. So, Henri de Montherlant in short, 1895 to 1972, was a French essayist, novelist and dramatist. So Montherlant was a very well known modernist writer. Montherlant writes a novel Pasiphae, where sexual perversity, the heroine's infatuation with the bull, is presented as a triumphant return to nature, as the liberation of impulse from the slavery of convention. Now, this story of Pasiphae is taken from Greek mythology. There is a famous tragedy by Racine named Pasiphae. Pasiphae was the queen who fell in love with the bull and had sexual intercourse with the bull, as a result of which Minotaur was born. But Pasiphae also had an attraction towards her stepson. So that is the subject of Racine's play. So Montherlant here speaks about not Pasiphae's love with her stepson, but with the bull. And this perversion is represented as a glorification or a triumphant return to nature, liberation of impulse from slavery. The chorus, that is the author, puts the following question, which though rhetorical, clearly expresses an appeal. Si l'absence de pensée, l'absence de morale ne contribue pas beaucoup à la dignité des planètes et des eaux. If the absence of thought and the absence of morality do not contribute a goodwill to the dignity of animals, plants and bodies of water. So, you see the train of thought. Absence of thought and absence of morality, Montherlant suggests, leads to dignity of animals, plants and water. So it is a kind of naturist thought, return to nature, kind of Rousseauist thought. That is, if you remove human morality and human thought from this universe, then it is the pristine nature of animals, plants and water bodies which become dignified. Montherlant expresses as plainly as Musil, though with different moral and emotional emphasis, the hidden or repressed social character of the protest, underlying this obsession with psychopathology, which perverted Rousseauism. So Rousseauism is here, but Rousseau never thought of such things. He could not think of such things because he was not a modernist. So the modernists make the return to nature very absurd by taking it to its extreme kind of conclusion. But Lucas says that it is a protest. There are many illustrations of this in modernist writing. A poem of Benn will serve to make the point. So he is quoting from Gottfried Benn, an important German poet. You will find in the notes that I have given, oh, that we were our primal ancestors, small lumps of plasma in hot sultry swabs, life, death, conception, persuasion, emerging from those juices, soundless. A pond of seaweed or a dune of sand, formed by the wind and heavy at the base, a dragonfly or gull's wing, already these would signify excessive suffering. So, what you find in this kind of poem is that a return to the primal nature of things. And this is a kind of longing. Oh, that we were our primal ancestors. Wish and primal ancestors, the lumps of plasma. So an extreme return, as you can see, from a multicellular complex organism to unicellular or something like that plasma state, where there is life-death conceptual perturbation from the juices. But the developed forms, the complex forms, dragonfly or Gulf's wing, there is excessive suffering in these complex forms. The suggestion is that if we could go back to our cellular level, then our resistance would have been less full of suffering. This is not overtly perverse in the manner of Beckett or Montellon, yet in his primitivism, Paine is at one with them. The opposition of man as animal to man, the opposition of man as animal to man as social being. So, the Aristotelian phrase zoon politikon, that is political animal, is it has a kind of unity of thought, but it is ruptured, it is torn into two, animal and social. Man as animal and man as social. So zoom and politikon, these two are separated as if there is no unity between them. Heidegger, the evaluation of the social as das man. The primitive is praised as something normal. The German word Mann is the indefinite pronoun equivalent to the English one. So when Heidegger refers to the social as das Mann, it means the one. That is a pronoun which does not have any particularity, any particular features. So the social becomes empty of all its meaning in this expression of das Mann. Klages' assertion of the incompatibility of Geist and Seele, or Rosenberg's racial mythology. So I go back to the notes. Friedrich Konrad Eduard Wilhelm Ludwig Klages, 1872 to 1956, was a German philosopher, psychologist, graphologist, poet, writer and lecturer who was a two-time nominee for the Nobel Prize in Literature. He is considered one of the most important thinkers of the 20th century. His thought is often seen as the link between Nietzsche and much of contemporary continental philosophy. Even Klages once regarding his the most plundered body of work of the present age. Jürgen Habermas, who regarded Klages as well ahead of his time, describes his philosophy as anti-spiritual. So what is important is that Klages makes a distinction between the spirit and the soul. So he is against Hegel, a pioneering figure of critique against the Hegelian notion of spirit as adverse to the affirmation of life. So he speaks against the unity of spirit and soul. He asserts the incompatibility of Geist. Geist is spirit, Seele is soul. So he is a philosopher who opposed spirit to soul. Rosenberg, here you can see in the note, Alfred Rosenberg, a Nazi ideologist of anti-Semitism, author of The Myth of the 20th Century, who spoke about racial mythology. So according to Lukács, Heidegger, Klages, Rosenberg, they all lead straight to a glorification of the abnormal and to an undisguised anti-humanism. So these philosophers, these thinkers, they may be said to be anti-humanist in the sense that they oppose the Hegelian notion of the unity of spirit and soul. A typology limited in this way to the Monia Soswell and the idiot also opens the door to experimental stylistic distortion. Average man with average tastes and appetite. Monia Soswell, Hume, I think it is Hume, Monia Soswell. Average man with average appetite and the idiot. So this is the range of types of character in modernist writing. It opens the door to experimental stylistic distortion. So we here have another word, distortion, a word which we know from art criticism. Cubist painters like Picasso and modern abstract painters, they use distortion in their drawing. Distortion becomes as inseparable a part of the portrayal of reality as the recourse to the pathological. But literature must have a concept of the normal if it is to place distortion correctly. So, if we use the term distortion, it would mean that there is a normal form which is being distorted. So, the conception of normal must be there in order to understand distortion. With such a typology, this placing is impossible since the normal is no longer a proper object of literary interest. Because writers like Musil, Montherlant, these writers, Beckett, they represent the normal as either an average man or an idiot. So they are not objects of literary interest. Life under capitalism is often rightly presented as a distortion, a petrification or paralysis of the human substance. But to present psychopathology as a way of escape from this distortion is itself a distortion. So you can see Lukács's point of criticism against modernism, that even though modernist writing has some qualities of protest against the blasé bourgeois reality, yet it tries to present distortion and the average person as ideals. And that kind of literature becomes very uninteresting. Why? Because it does not make use of the dialectical relationship between man and his environment. That is, the whole content of realism is thrown out. So, even though it is true that under bourgeois capitalism life becomes petrified or paralyzed, even then the human substance cannot be totally liquidated or totally neglected. But so Lukács says that this is itself a distortion. We are invited to measure one type of distortion against another and arrive necessarily at universal distortion. There is no principle to set against this general pattern, no standard by which the petit bourgeois and the pathological can be seen in their social context. So, the earlier point made by Lukács that unlike bourgeois revolution, proletarian revolution, the modernists, they do not present a terminus ad or a goal or an alternative world order. Nothing is suggested which might replace this petit bourgeois pathological standard. And these tendencies, far from being relativized with time, become ever more absolute. Distortion becomes the normal condition of human existence, the proper study of the formative principle of art and literature. So, if distortion becomes the normal condition of existence under capitalism in modernistic writing, then the distortion becomes the order of the day. So the literary implications of this ideology, Lukács says, I have already explained. Let us now pursue the argument further. So what are the literary implications of this ideology? The writings of Kafka, Maupassant and James Joyce and other modernist writers, Samuel Beckett, where the distortion becomes the rule and it becomes less and less interesting. The average man or the idiot, they become the protagonist, they become the norm. So it is clear that modernism must deprive literature of a sense of perspective. This would not be surprising. Rigorous modernists such as Kafka, Ben and Musil have always indignantly refused to provide their readers with any such thing. Perspective. Perspective is something which we use in realism. Perspective in art was discovered in the Renaissance. As art evolved from medieval two-dimensional art, the attempt to describe three-dimensional world was possible when the perspective was discovered. The best example of perspective in Renaissance writing, Renaissance painting is, I think it is by Raphael, the Platonic Academy, where we see arches, a number of arches in perspective. In literature also, perspective is a hallmark of realism. But writers like Kafka and Musil, they do not give us perspective. They refuse to give the reader perspective because there is no context. Unless there is a historical context, you cannot place the character or the hero in a perspective. I will return to the ideological implication of the idea of perspective later. Let me say here that in any work of art, perspective is overriding importance. It determines the course and content. It draws together the threads of the narration. It enables the artist to choose between the important and the superficial, the crucial and the episodic. The direction in which characters develop is determined by perspective. Only those features being described which are material to their development. So perspective also gives the reader an idea about the priorities of the novel or the work of art, work of literature, and in which direction it will take us. The direction is determined by perspective. Only those features being described with the material, the development. The more lucid the perspective, as in Molière or the Greeks, the more economical and striking the selection. So, compared to modern art and modern literature, Greek literature or neoclassical literature, as in Molière, they give us simple perspective, and therefore this kind of art is more economical. Modernism drops this selective principle. It asserts that it can dispense with it or can replace it with its dogma of the condicio humaine. So, selective principle is essential for representing anything realistically. But the idea of human condition or human fate, this modernistic dogma, there is a total lack of selection, total lack of perspective. A naturalistic style is bound to be the result. This state of affairs, which to my mind characterizes all modernist art of the past 50 years, is disguised by critics who systematically glorify the modern. So the condition humaine suggests the world without a perspective, if we look at the world without a perspective, then we see it in a naturalistic fashion. Let us imagine that we are looking at a cell under the microscope. So we are not seeing how the cell is situated in the whole body. We have taken a tiny part of the body, the cell, and thereby you are losing the perspective. So this is naturalism. Like if we take a very close photograph, a close shot of anything, then we tend to lose the perspective, and sometimes it is difficult to understand what we are looking at. So if you do not take the photograph of an entire face, or even an entire nose or entire lip, but only a part of that, then it will be difficult to identify that this is a part of a lip or a part of a nose, because we lose the perspective. So this is naturalism. So Lukács says that the obvious result is naturalism. By concentrating on formal criteria, by isolating technique from content and exaggerating its importance, these critics refrain from judgment on the social or artistic significance of subject matter. So, in realism, we have a dialectical relationship between form and content, which means that the author or the writer or the artist must consider both form and content in order to produce his work. But in modernism, this relationship is neglected, and everything is isolated from its context. Therefore, the form is often exaggerated over content, and the result is that the writer or the author or the artist loses all consideration of the context, or it becomes impossible for the author to judge his subject matter. That is, in such a work there would be no social judgment, there would be no political judgment, because the whole historical context is removed. They are unable in consequence to make the aesthetic distinction between realism and naturalism. This distinction depends on the presence or absence in a work of art of hierarchy of significance in the situations and characters presented. So, naturalism loses sight of hierarchy of significance or priority, question of priority, which involves judgment. So, if we want to represent something, if we want to say represent a face, and we do not represent the whole face but represent a part of the nose, that is, representation, naturalistic representation. It can be even photographic representation, but it will not carry any sense. We cannot make any judgment over the face because we cannot see the whole face. So it becomes kind of eccentricism, and there is no hierarchy, no degree, no context by which we can judge. Compared with these formal categories are of secondary importance. That is why it is possible to speak of the basically naturalistic character of modern literature and to see here the literary expression of an ideological continuity. Now, this part is Lukács is making an important comment here. He is trying to show the continuity from realism to naturalism. And he says that in naturalism formal categories. In realism, formal categories are of secondary importance, and modernistic literature is therefore not realism, not realistic, but naturalistic. Because in modernistic literature, even though naturalism is a continuation of modernism, but in the process, the hierarchy of significance is lost, and therefore modernistic literature becomes naturalistic or deviates from realism. So Lukács says that it is the literary expression of an ideological continuity. Why ideological continuity? Realism was also produced by the bourgeois class. In course of time, it degraded into naturalism. Naturalism is also a production of bourgeois class. So there is an ideological continuity. This is not to deny that variations in style reflect changes in society, but the particular form this principle of naturalistic arbitrariness, its lack of hierarchic structure may take, is not decisive. So, Lukács says that I am not denying that any development, any change is the result of an historical process. But in case of modernistic literature, the naturalism or naturalistic arbitrariness is a result of the lack of hierarchic structure. But which form of naturalism art would take, that cannot be said in a decisive manner. Which means that Lukács here wants to say that even though we, by judging dialectically the progress of naturalism from realism, we may be sure, we may assert that naturalism is a continuation or a development from realism. But what form or which form that naturalism would take, that cannot be decided. We encounter it in the all-determining social conditions of naturalism. In symbolism, symbolism's impressionistic method and its cultivation of the exotic. Now you see that even in naturalism, one speaks of social conditions. So if I remember that Émile Zola's novels were the examples of naturalism, then we see that those novels represent social political conditions of the time. The famous novel Germinal, where it is represented that the French people of a town, they are afraid that the Belge would come and take their jobs in the coal mining industry by providing cheap labor. So there is depiction of society, there is depiction of social political problems. But because of Zola's style, the novel cannot be called realism, it can be called naturalism. Then the impressionistic styles, that is of symbolist writers, that is another form that may develop out of the main realistic tradition. The symbolists or the impressionists, they cultivate the exotic. And there are such movements as futurism, constructivism, and Neue Sachlichkeit. Sachlichkeit means, Sach means thing, thingliness. So, new thingliness. So, that is also another form of realism, kind of movement of realism. So, again, surrealism emphasizes on stream of consciousness. So, Lukács is pointing at the different forms that modernism may take or naturalism may take. It can be symbolistic, impressionistic, it can be futuristic, constructivist, or Neuzeitlichkeit, or surrealist. So all these forms are developments from the tradition of realism. As realism filters down to naturalism, then it may take different forms. These schools have in common a basically static approach to reality. This is closely related to their lack of perspective. So you remember that lack of perspective, lack of hierarchy is the quality of naturalism. And because of this lack of perspective, these movements, they are static in their approach. Characteristically, Gottfried Benn actually incorporated this in his artistic program. One of his volumes bears the title Static Poets. So what is static? Denial of history, of development, and thus of perspective. It becomes the mark of true insight into the nature of reality. Quoting from Gottfried Benn, the wise man is ignorant of change and development. His children and children's children are no part of the world. So the wise man is ignorant, which means the whole perspective collapses and there is no continuity because his children's children are not part of his world anymore. So this becomes a static worldview because for the wise man there is no way forward. The rejection of any concept of the future is for Benn the criterion of wisdom. But even those modernist writers who are less extreme in their rejection of history tend to present social and historical phenomena as static. Then of small importance, it is then of small importance whether this condition is eternal or only a transitional stage punctuated by sudden catastrophe. Even in early naturalism, the static presentation was often broken up by these catastrophes without altering its basic character. So, Lucas is talking about writers like Musil. His essay, The Writer in Our Age, Musil writes, one knows just as little about the present. Partly this is because we are, as always, too close to the present. But it is also because the present into which we were plunged some 2 decades ago is of a particularly all-embracing and inescapable character. What does that mean? That means that the present, which was 2 decades ago, still remains the same. Therefore, it is a static worldview, which means that we cannot chart any progress from present to the future. Whether or not Musil knew of Heidegger's philosophy, the idea of Geworfenheit is clearly at work here. And the following reveals plainly how for Musil the static state was upset by the catastrophe of 1940. So World War is a catastrophe. So Lucas has said earlier that there is a transitional state and a sudden catastrophe. There is nothing eternal. All of a sudden, the world was full of violence. Musil writing on the World War. In European civilization, there was a sudden drift. In short, the static apprehension of reality in modernist literature is no passing fashion. It is rooted in the ideology of war. Alright. So, we have to remember what is Lukács' point of view on the ideology of modernism. He does not say that the static quality is an accidental quality. But he says that it is rooted in the ideology, which means that the decadence of bourgeois ideology obviously led to this kind of static approach. And how does Lukács arrive at such a judgment? Obviously, because he is a Marxist, so he is using the principles of dialectical materialism, which you know that Marx also borrowed from Hegel the idea of thesis, antithesis and synthesis. So from such a dialectical point of view, Lukács can see or can comment that the modernistic approach is not a dialectical progression, but it is a static approach. To establish the basic distinction between modernism and that realism, which from Homer to Thomas Mann and Gorky has assumed change and development to be the proper subject of literature, we must go deeper into the underlying ideological problem. So you see that Lukács' concept of the realistic tradition becomes, more and more inclusive. So he already started from the Greek, he referred to Aristotle's Zoon Politikon, and he now refers to Homer. So the realistic tradition starts from Homer and he connects Homer to Thomas Mann and Gorky. So this is a very long time. But of course there is a progression and there are developments, there are changes. It has assumed change and development to be the proper subject of literature. So realism has always assumed that there is change and progression. So one who is a believer in dialectical materialism, like Lukács, would also believe in realism, which believes in progress. Ironically, you see, the idea of progress is actually a bourgeois idea. It was a product of the Enlightenment. Later, theoreticians, they actually questioned the idea of progress. And Walter Benjamin said that the angel of history, her face is looking backwards turn, and a storm is blowing from heaven, which is called progress. But the angel of history stands opposed to this storm of progress. So in Walter Benjamin's idea of history, we find a kind of nostalgia for the past and a little belief or little faith in progress. And progress is a bourgeois idea, a product of the Enlightenment idea, but again, Marxists also believe in progress. Now, Walter Benjamin was also a Marxist, but he was a Marxist of a different stamp than Lukács. Lukács was more of a kind of conservative Marxist, and therefore he believes in progress because he believes in Marxist dialectic, which is rooted in Hegelian dialectic, which is rooted in the Enlightenment tradition. In The House of the Dead, Dostoevsky gave an interesting account of the convict's action to work. He described how the prisoners, in spite of brutal discipline, loafed about, working badly, or merely going through the motions of work until a new overseer arrived and allotted them a new project, after which they were allowed to go home. So Dostoevsky's story. The work was hard, Dostoevsky continues, but Christ, with what energy they threw themselves into it, cornered all their former indolence and pretended incompetence. Later in the book, Dostoevsky sums up his experience. If a man loses hope and has no aim in view, sheer boredom can turn him into a beast. So the objective of telling this story is that modernism seems to be a human condition where man loses hope, and therefore he becomes more like an animal, a bored animal. I have said that the problem of perspective in literature is directly related to the principle of selection. Let me go further. Underlying the problem is a profound ethical complex. Let me go further. Underlying the problem is a profound ethical complex reflected in the composition of the work itself. Every human action is based on the presupposition of its inherent meaningfulness, at least the subject. Lukács was fighting a losing battle because more and more modern philosophy, modern theories would speak of meaninglessness rather than meaningfulness. But Lukács believes, like a traditional optimist Marxist, that every human action is based on a presupposition of its inherent meaningfulness. Absence of meaning makes a mockery of action and reduces art into naturalistic deception. And that is what we see in the writings of Sartre, in the writings of Albert Camus, the lack of meaning. Clearly, there can be no literature without at least the appearance of change or development. This conclusion should not be interpreted in a narrowly metaphysical sense. We have already diagnosed the obsession with psychopathology in modernist literature, the desire to escape from the reality of capitalism, but this implies the absolute primacy of the terminus a quo, the condition from which it is desired to escape. Any movement towards a terminus ad quem is condemned to impotence. So, Lukács says that the attempt to escape from bourgeois reality of capitalism finds an expression in the obsession with psychopathology. But this is the primacy of the terminus a quo, that is the condition from which one wants to escape. And no attempt can be made to an alternative order of reality, the terminus ad quem. So, Lukács understands modernism as a kind of metaphysical failure of inventing a new world order. As the ideology of most modernist writers asserts the unalterability of outward reality, even if this is reduced to a mere state of consciousness, human activities are a priori rendered important and robbed of meaning. So, the lack of meaning in human action in modernist literature is interpreted by Lukács as ideological. Why ideological? Because it is a failed attempt to escape from a particular situation without imagining an alternative world order. That is why it is ideological. Because ideology is never truth. Ideology is always false. Ideology is always a kind of failure, kind of untruth. The apprehension of reality to which this leads is most consistently and convincingly realized in the work of Kafka. Kafka remarks of Joseph K. as he is being led to execution. He thought of flight, their tiny wings breaking as they struggle away from the flyway. This mood of total impotence, of paralysis in the face of the unintelligible power of circumstances, informs all his work. So, reality is apprehended as a paralyzing state of affairs in Kafka. Just like the hopelessness and the powerlessness of a fly. This hero Joseph K., when he is being taken to execution, he feels a similar hopelessness or paralysis. So the action of the castle takes a different, even opposite direction to that of the trial. This view of the world from the perspective of a trapped and struggling fly is all perversive. This experience, this vision of the world dominated by angst and of man at the mercy of incomprehensible terrors, makes Kafka's work the very type of modernist art. So whether it is in his novel The Trial or The Castle, we see Kafka depicts a world which is incomprehensible and therefore terrorizing, full of angst. Techniques elsewhere of merely formal significance are used here to evoke a primitive awe in the presence of an utterly strange and hostile reality. Kafka's angst is the experience par excellence of modernism. Right. So, the typical question raised by Lucas, Franz Kafka or Thomas Mann. Both are modernist writers, but Kafka for Lukács is the modernist par excellence, because he creates this sense of meaninglessness and the terror that rises out of this meaning. Two instances from musical criticism, which can afford to be both franker and more theoretical than literary criticism, show that it is indeed a universal experience with which we are dealing. Now it comes to music. Theodor Adorno was a great critic of music. So Lukács is referring to Adorno also. But first he speaks of Hans Eisler. The composer says of Schoenberg, long before the invention of the bomber, he expressed what people are to feel in the air raid shelters. So the music of Schoenberg, modernist music, which gives an idea of terror. Even more characteristic, though seen from a modernist point of view, is Adorno's analysis, the aging of modern music, of symptoms of decadence in modernist music. The sounds are still the same, but the experience of angst which made their originals great has vanished. Modernist music, according to Adorno, loses its meaning. Modernist music has lost touch with the truth that was its raison d'être, which is not being. Composers are no longer equal to the emotional presuppositions of their modernism, and that is why modernist music has failed. Composers are not equal to the emotional presuppositions of modernism, means that the composers cannot adequately express the emotional outlook of modernism. And that is why it is failed. The diminution of the original angst-obsessed vision of life, whether due, as Adorno thinks, to inability to respond to the magnitude of the horror, or as I believe, to the fact that this obsession with angst among bourgeois intellectuals has already begun to be seen, has brought about loss of substance in modern music. So, ironically, this angst, which is the characteristic of modernism, which can be found in Schoenberg's music. Adorno says that modern music is aging. That is, it is more and more lacking its original angst, and the composers are failing. So there is a loss of substance. This is a shrewd analysis of the paradoxical situation of the modernist artist, particularly where he is trying to express deep and genuine experience. The deeper the experience, the greater the damage to the artistic whole. But this tendency towards disintegration, this loss of artistic unity, cannot be written off as a mere fashion, the product of experimental gimmicks. Modern philosophy, after all, encountered these problems long before modern literature paid it. So, Lukács says that the problems of modernist musicians or composers, they were experienced earlier by the philosophers. So, before art, literature, music experienced the problems, philosophers first realized the problems associated with modernism. the quality of modernism is disintegration, loss of artistic unity, and the problem with this lack of wholeness, lack of integrity, artistic unity, substance, this may be seen, for example, in the way time, the concept of time has changed in philosophy, according to Lukács. Subjective, case in point is the problem of time, subjective idealism had already separated time, abstractly conceived, from historical change and particularity of place. This subjective idealism, we have seen it with the advent of Romanticism. And from a subjective point of view, time is separated from the historical time, which is the objective time. As if this separation were insufficient for the new age of imperialism, perhaps have widened it further. The French philosopher Bergson, he gave us the concept of time and duration. Experience time, subjective time, now become identical with real time. The rift between this time and that of the objective world was lost. So, historical time for Lukács is the real time. But the time which is felt by an individual, that is subjective time. These two cannot be the same. But Bergson made them identical. And therefore the concept of time kind of collapsed. Bergson and other philosophers who took up and varied this theme claimed that their concept of time alone afforded insight into authentic, that is subjective reality. The same tendency soon made its appearance in literature. Okay, so there is a chapter in the book called The Modern Tradition, which I have referred to you. There you will find a chapter on Bergson, which will be very helpful. So what is the issue here? That as long as we understand time as a historical flow, as an objective, there is no problem. But the moment there is no problem, in which sense? Realism remains intact, because realism is rooted in history. So if historical time is accepted as the only time, then the problem of realism, the concept of realism, is not endangered, it does not have any problem. But if I say that the time I can feel or experience, my subjective time, is the same as real time, then there is a problem, because historical reality is not the same as an individual's experience of reality. And that is what we see in this stream of consciousness technique. Joyce never tells us the historical time in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, for example. He never tells us which year he is referring to, exactly what is Stephen's age at that point of time. He represents time as a flow in the psyche of Stephen. So we cannot pinpoint and we cannot distinguish the historical age and Stephen's own feeling of that period. So even though there are references to historical movements like the Irish freedom struggle, the language movement, and so on and so forth, but Joyce never mentions any year. So deliberately historical time is blurred so that the subjective time becomes predominant. And can this time be called authentic? Definitely not. Because this time is true for only one individual. The moment we give recognition to subjective time, we will have to accept that time is experienced differently by different people. Everybody's experience of time, of subjective time, is different. Therefore, we lose all, we lose the scale by which we can compare. We cannot compare. We lose the scale. The scale is the historical time. So, therefore, there is an the consequences of feeling of anarchy or a feeling of a flow of time in our consciousness, which we cannot pinpoint and so on. The German left-wing critic and essayist of the 20s, Walter Benjamin, has well described Proust's vision and the techniques he uses to present it in his great novel. Proust is, of course, the greatest novelist who made use of this kind of subjective time in remembrance of things past. Because whatever Proust depicts in that novel is not reality. It is memory. So the flow of time that is mentioned there, that is also in somebody's consciousness. Benjamin wrote on Proust. We all know that Proust does not describe a man's life as it actually happens, but as it is remembered by a man who has lived through it. Yet this puts it far too crudely, for it is not actual experience that is important, but the texture of reminiscence, the Penelope's tapestry of a man's memory. So, a radical departure from 19th century realism, because realist novel always represented historical time, but Proust represents somebody's memory. It does not represent reality, and it is not the reality or the experience which is important, but it is the texture of reminiscence. Okay. The connection with Bergson's theories of time is obvious, but whereas with Bergson, in the abstraction of philosophy, the unity of perception is preserved, Benjamin shows that with Proust, as a result of the radical disintegration of the time sequence, objectivity is eliminated. Benjamin is a very perceptive Marxist critic, and Proust definitely makes use of Bergson's concept of time as a flow in somebody's psyche, somebody's consciousness, but this way of writing totally disintegrates sequence of time, that is historicity of time. Therefore, there is no objectivity. We cannot judge Proust's work objectively. A lived event is finite, concluded at least on the level of experience, but a remembered event is infinite, a possible key to everything that preceded it and to everything that will follow it. Because memory, works in many ways, in both ways, backward and forward. So, it does not describe a finite experience. It describes an event which is infinite. One can go back and forth in memory. It is the distinction between a philosophical and an artistic vision of the world. However, hard philosophy, under the influence of idealism, tries to liberate the concepts of space and time from temporal and spatial particularity, literature continues to assume their unity. Very interesting sentence. Lucas suggests that philosophy tries very hard to liberate the concept of space and time from particularity under the influence of idealism. Very significant. Because Lukács is a Marxist, so he is analyzing that the weakness of this philosophical position lies in its idealism and the desire to idealistically separate space and time or to liberate these concepts from there. We see that in Bersaw's philosophy. To distinguish between the idealized flow of time without particularity and the objective particular time and space of history. So Lukács says that in Bergson or in philosophers we see the desire to create this distinction, this rift between particular historical time and idealized free-flowing time, subjective time. On the other hand, Lukács says, even though philosophy is trying to separate these two, literature or art always tries to bring them together and produce a unity, assume their unity. The fact, nevertheless, the concept of subjective time propped up in literature only shows how deeply subjectivism is rooted in the experience of the modern bourgeois intellectual. So, why did the idea of subjective time at all appear in literature? Lukács says that it indicates that philosophically the bourgeois intellectual, he is deeply rooted in subjectivity. The individual retreating into himself in despair at the cruelty of the age may experience an intoxicated fascination with his forlorn condition. But when a new horror breaks through, if the reality cannot be understood or no effort is made to understand it, then the individual subjectivity alone in the universe, reflecting only itself, takes on an equally incomprehensible and horrific character. So Lukács says that we think that a philosopher of the modern times would try to withdraw from the world and even enjoy his loneliness, his forlorn nature, forlorn condition. And as a result, something happens. It does not solve the problem that this world which is horrible, which is a place full of angst, full of anxiety, by withdrawing or retreating from this world into subjectivity, the philosopher cannot escape, because there a new kind of snare, a new kind of trap becomes, it is produced, a new kind of situation arises where the philosopher finds himself trapped in this subjectivity, this loneliness, and this incomprehensible world of individual subjectivity. Which means that if you remove the context from anything, then that thing becomes meaningless. So if philosophically we remove our subjectivity from this world, then our subjectivity becomes problematized, it becomes meaningless. So the modernistic attempt in literature is to give expression to this existential meaninglessness and horror that rises out of it. And look at this example of Hugo von Hofmannsthal, German poet. He was to experience this condition very early in his poetic career. It is a thing that no man cares to think on, and far too terrible for mere complaint that all things slip from us and pass away and that my ego, bound by no outward force, once a small child slippered with the mind, should now be strange to me as a strange dog. So what do these lines mean? That it means that uh, first everything slips away from us. We lose the grip of the real world when we retreat into our subjective world. And then when we are, proud of our subjectivity, my ego, my subjectivity, my pride, even then we find that the further rift is created between my ego and me. So the poet says that once it was a small child, so before it became mine. So the child's ego is not the same as the grown-up man's ego, which means that there is an alienation of man from himself. He can see his own ego fractured and alienated from himself. By separating time from the outer world of objective reality, the inner world of the subject is transformed into a sinister, inexplicable flux and acquires paradoxically a static character. So there is no particular direction in which one can move from this position, from this situation. Alright, so only 5 minutes are left. So if you have any questions, you can ask. Do you have any questions?
Actually, the person participated.
Okay, so have you followed everything? Yes, I suppose so.
Yes, sir. And so that point about time, that was so interesting. I kept on thinking about that for a very long time, even
Yeah.
after you were done with that.
Yes, exactly. So that is why I am referring you to that book, The Tradition of Modernism. And there you read that chapter on Bergson, you will find it very interesting. And that also helps us understand novelists like Proust. And of course, Benjamin's writing on Proust is also very interesting. I hope that you will like that.
Sure, sir.
So any other question or comment? Okay, so if you do not have any other question or comment, then should we stop here for today? No question. Okay then, so let us stop here today. Thank you.
So, irrespective of the gender, if
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Welcome.